2 of the Skeleton Key to Agamben's Homo Sacer. The previous video ended a little abruptly. Sorry about that. We were just about halfway through the introduction to the book. But since we had already walked through the central concepts, I think I'm going to go ahead and skip directly to the beginning of chapter 1 as such. I think the only idea that we didn't get to was the notion that modern democracies, or modern states, regardless of whether they're democracies or not, are sort of fated now to incorporate bare life or zoe into the primary functioning of the state. We're in biopolitics. We're no longer in sort of moral politics. And so that this is that the decisionism, or the decision between who is in and out of the category of Homo Sacer, who's essentially in and out of camps, who's in and out of the definition of the full moral subject and so on, is something that is in play in politics and political decision making everywhere. Whether you're in a regime of whether you're in a political regime that fancies itself as democratic or not. Okay, so I'm going to try to move fairly fast through the book, and I'll try to keep a sort of. So we're going to look at part 1 then, the logic of sovereignty, chapter 1, the paradox of sovereignty. So it's in this chapter where he really begins with Schmitt's political theology and the ideas of the sovereign exception being the thing that generates and determines sovereignty, right? So as Schmitt writes, sovereign is he who with the power to declare or decide or determine when we're in a state of exception. The sovereign is the person who's capable of setting aside the law. Therefore, the sovereign becomes essentially the law. So the idea that we're in a democracy, we're a nation of laws, is a problematic concept when you're dealing with Schmittian sovereignty, because the nation of laws, if you're in a state of exception, the laws get set aside, and the unitary sovereign, right, the decider, really holds all the power. So, the way that Agamben writes about it is that essentially life and the state become one, because the state is no longer something with a set of laws that determines everyday life, but everyday life is something now that's entirely captured by the state. So you wind up with a much more powerful state apparatus, a much more powerful sovereignty or sovereign under the state of exception, right? Because you're able to set aside the kind of protections and procedures and checks and balances and so on that would be part of normal power. Okay, so there's extreme dictatorial power of the sovereign. Decisions are made by executive decree, executive order, I guess, in the American terminology. The exception, on the other hand, thinks the general with intense passion. All law becomes situational law. The sovereign creates and guarantees the situation's entire totality. So there's a suspension of normal law, the suspension of normal rules, that kind of thing that happens. So you're in an era of a situation of decisionism with a unitary executive and something along the lines of sovereign dictatorship in the way that Schmitt writes about it. Okay, on page 18, he makes a comparison to Foucault's Madness and Civilization, in which Foucault writes about the Great Confinement, where the mad or the unreasonable are placed, or categories of people who don't fit the overarching structure, are placed inside of an asylum of some type, or inside of they're confined within like a former leper colony or something. They're confined. And therefore, those people are in a state of exception, right? They're not part of the normal polity. They're not part of the normal everyday life. They're thrown inside. And then that becomes a mechanism. The state of exception then is the way that the non-accept, that everyday politics is defined. And so this would be the relation of exception. Then it's a relationship between the thing that's included or that's excluded and the thing that's in. So in Foucault, you put the mad in confinement, and then that leaves, the reasonable, the sane, the civilized outside, something along those lines. So you confine inside to define the outside. So the state of exception doesn't just, and the decision about who is in the category of Homo Sacer, who's in the category, the person outside of rights, doesn't just define that category, it defines the outside as well. Okay. All right. So so that's that. The Nomos of the Earth is talked about on page 19. So that's a description of Schmidt's other work where he makes the argument, he makes a distinction between the Nomos of the Earth and the Nomos of the sea. The Nomos is the law, right? So there's a law or a legal principle that is associated with the earth, with continental territories and so on, and that's distinguished from the Nomos of the sea, a kind of legal principle or ordering principle that's associated, with seafaring and trading peoples. And so along the way, he's trying to make a distinction between what nomos means and how it's different from law, those kinds of things. And in the end, he's arguing that nomos is an ordering principle. It's a localization or territorialization principle. It's not just about the law, but it's really about the power behind the law, the organization and structuring of sovereignty within a territory. So it's like a logic, an overarching organizing logic. So it's bigger than the law, but incorporates the law, right? So the Nomos of the Earth is different than the Nomos of the sea. And so then Agamben then is going to be trying to explain what the Nomos of modernity is, or what the Nomos of modern democratic society is. And he's going to be making the argument that the state of exception and bare life and Homo Sacer and even concentration camps of some kind become the nomos, the ordering principle, the localization, the structuring principle of modern society. Okay, so he's using again Carl Schmitt there to go. Page 26, he makes the argument that the law of the talon, lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, affiliated with the American, backcountry West, blood feuds, those kind of things, right? You get off my land, or I'm going to come and shoot your dog, that kind of thing. Where it's the tit for tat, eye for eye, tooth for tooth thing. And so he makes the argument that in the essence, that very primary primitive form of law, originary form of law, is actually the imposition of a state of exception, because law as such, normally killing someone, right, would be part of a legal structure and be outlawed. But if someone has hurt your dog or hurt your daughter, then you've got a law itself has been suspended, and you've been granted an exception to go ahead and to avenge yourself. So vengeance, the originary law of vengeance, of blood feuds, and of lex talionis, is really, as he claims, a kind of early form of the state of exception. So again, normally you can't kill, but you can in revenge. So so the state of exception then is a form of originary law. Page 27, a lot of writing about guilt, including Carl Schmitt's writings about guilt. He's really into Schmitt here. And the indistinction between law and life in the state of exception. Yeah, so guilt is a marker, right? It's not, as he says, guilt refers not to transgression of the law, right? That is, to the determination. It's not about the determination of the licit or the legal versus the illicit or the illegal. Instead, guilt is linked to the pure force of the law, to the law's simple reference to something, right? So you're guilty. When you're guilty, ignorance of the law of the rule does not eliminate guilt. Therefore, it is the impossibility of deciding if it is the guilt that grounds the rule that posits guilt. The indistinction between the outside and the inside of the legal order between life and law characterizes the sovereign decision on exception. So guilt is becomes sort of transformed in the exception, right? So life and law get overlaid upon each other, right? In the state of exception, and that this transforms then the juridical concept of guilt is imposed in a different way. I don't have a way to. Yeah. So on page 28 and 9, the social nature of sovereignty. Yeah, so he is making the argument here that, the exception is the structure of sovereignty, and sovereignty is not exclusively a political concept or an exclusively juridical category, a power external to law, or the supreme rule of the juridical order, which is Kelson's argument. It is the originary structure in which law refers to life and includes it in itself by suspending it. So that idea of guilt, you're guilty that law and life are overlaid by each other, and again you're captured by and contained within the legal within this legal order. So the relation of exception is the relation of a band, right? So this is going to become a big article. The social nature of sovereignty, relation of the band. So the people who are excluded versus the people that aren't. The sovereign relationship to Homo Sacer is a relationship of banning, right? So this is going to be a big idea as we move forward. So banning is the mode of the sovereign exception, right? Being, banned. He talks about being abandoned, those kinds of things. The law, the language of abandonment being important. All right, chapter 2, Nomos Basilius. Here he talks about sovereignty, the nomos again, the ordering principle of, involves the unification of violence and justice. Yeah, so this is sort of like an overarching principle in the West, is that sovereignty, the political as such, it's a legitimate. You're legitimately able to use violence. So violence is a mechanism for justice and not something outside of it. And so that means that justice and violence, again, are in this zone of indistinction from each other. You don't have justice here and violence out here, but you come inside. So the sovereign nomos, the ordering principle, is one that uses violence as a monopoly on violence to generate an ordering principle. The nomos is greater than the law. The sovereign principle is greater than the law. Again, the nomos of the earth, again, the Schmittian notion is talked about on page 36. Again, it's temporal, spatial localization, ordering principles of an entire legal structure, an entire patterning of life or mode of life. On page 38, he writes about the state of nature and the law and the exception, and he's got this wonderful image here that really, I think, is a clarifier. So he depicts here what the state of exception is. So if you begin with the state of nature, zoē, and the state of law, out here sort of bios, in separate categories, in the state of exception, one is inside of the other, and as the exception starts to become the rule, the two circles coincide in the absolute indistinction. Okay? So in the state of exception, life itself becomes incorporated in and captured inside of the legal system by the sovereign, right? So when a state of emergency is declared, all of life becomes subject to the law. You can take property, you can order people about, you can alter people's everyday structure of life. So sovereign nomos allows you to restructure, right? And then if we are indeed moving into certain parts of life where there is no distinction between them. So the zone of indistinction looks like this, where there's no longer any that the threshold between, in this instance, nature and the law disappears. So whenever we're using the term zone of indistinction, this is really what we're referencing, something like this, where there's a total overlay of two normally opposed categories. Okay. All right. So in the next chapter, potentiality and the law, he writes about the distinction between constitutive power, constituting power. So that's the power, something along the lines of Weberian charismatic power, charismatic authority, where you're actually instantiating power, creating a new kind of power, operating not exactly like the sovereign in a Schmittian way, but very close to it. So you're not held by previous law or precedent. You're able to instantiate whatever a legal order you wish, and that's distinct from constitutive power, which is more in the realm like probably the rational legal category in Weber, possibly a traditional here. And this is coming from Benjamin's writings, and then there's a a third form of power. Yeah, no, this isn't actually. Benjamin is going to come. I'm sorry, he's going to be looking at violence soon, so we'll leave that out. Okay, so the ban is something a little bit separate from either constituting power or constituted power. It's a little bit different, but it's probably closer here. Page 53. The next chapter then is the form of law. So again, this is where he's going to be developing the ban as the form that the sovereign exception takes. So the ban occurs when, again, something like a Weberian charismatic authority, following Schmidt, right? Schmidt was essentially Weberian, has the power then to overlay law and life, where life and law are no longer separate spheres, but where they become collapsed onto each other. They fall into a zone of indistinction, right? On page 54, something like traditional authority is carved out as something separate. So tradition is being in force without signification. So that would be a legal structure that has power and force but lacks any signifier to explain it. So it would be like a traditional order where the rationality, the myth that explains the reason for particular legal principles are out of mind. But the banning someone from legal status, banning someone from rights, that is the form that the sovereign exception takes, right? So the entire history of the West is the time of abandonment. The structure is outside the form of law. Abandonment is always abandonment as a sovereign ban, right? So so it has multiple meanings, but it's really being banished, banishment, being thrown out of the legal protection. More on that as we go forward. Okay, I'll try to go faster here. Okay, so Benjamin's distinctions between on the history of violence between the three forms of violence that posits the law, something along the line of that constituting power, violence that preserves the law, constituted power, and then the separate form called divine violence. And so Benjamin thinks this is clear. Agamben thinks this is clarifying that the violence exercised in the state of exception clearly neither preserves a legal structure nor simply posits a legal structure, but rather conserves what was a legal structure by suspending it and pauses in accepting itself from it. So this is sort of that key thing that totalitarianism often proceeds not by completely wiping the law away, by placing it into suspension. So it's preserved, but it is set aside and becomes ineffective, and that's how the sovereign then gets power. All right. Okay. All right, we'll try to move more quickly. Okay, so the next section then is on Homo Sacer. So here's our famous section here. So within the state of exception then exists the Homo Sacer. Okay, so the concept of the sacred is talked about a little bit on page 71 to 75. So let's get first the definition of Homo Sacer. So Homo Sacer is the sacred man is the one whom the people have judged on account of a crime. It is not permitted to sacrifice this man, so they've lost religious and moral significance. Yet he who kills him will not be condemned for homicide in the first tribunician law. In fact, it is noted that if someone kills one who is sacred according to the plebiscite, it will not be considered homicide. This is why it is customary for a bad or impure man to be called sacred. So that seems like the concept of sacred is being here to reference something that's not sacred, that's a criminal. And so there's some discussion of this, what that might mean. We're going to get into the next chapter deals with the ambivalence of the concept of the sacred. But here what Agamben basically argues is that Homo Sacer isn't a sacred man in the normal sort of Durkheimian sense of being someone who's marked with the sacred good or the sacred pure, nor is it someone who's profane and merely is subject to sort of profane rules or profane action. But rather, the Homo Sacer is existing in this new space, this new zone that's been carved out by the sovereign, the state of exception. Okay, so Homo Sacer, bare life, the state of exception, is a zone of life that is outside of religious sacredness and outside of something like normal criminal or civil law, right? That you've been banned from those things. Okay, so when he writes about kind of a dual meaning, and the ambivalence of it, what Agamben means is that it lies between religion and profane everyday law, that it's in this zone in between. Okay, but then he goes to the next chapter where he writes about a number of thinkers who emphasize that the concept of the sacred was originally a term that referred both to good and to bad things, right? So the people that he writes about, so here we go. I just drawn out. So just to make that other point, the penal law of the profane and the religious law of the divine and the sacred are both suspended in the state of exception. So the sovereign makes the decision that generates the state of exception, and that's where Homo Sacer and bare life are there. We're later going to find out the sovereign himself or herself actually falls inside of the state of exception as well, that there's a parallel structure here for the sovereign making the exception, that they actually wind up in the same category. Okay, so in the ambivalence of the sacred, the meaning of sacredness is ambivalent. That means it's two-toned. So he follows Robertson Smith, Henri Hubert, and Marcel Mauss, Emile Durkheim, Freud, Benveniste. All of these writers emphasize that in original form, the original Latin, and even when you look at other societies that had a similar concept of sacredness, that it generally took on two poles. It meant both the good, in Durkheim's terms, the sacred pure, as well as the bad, the sacred impure, right? The auspicious and the inauspicious, right? So initially, it meant both good and bad, okay? The pure and the impure are therefore not two separate genera, but rather two varieties of the same genus, the sacred, that includes all sacred things. So there are two kinds of sacred things, the auspicious and the inauspicious, and no clear border between these two opposite kinds. So in the world that, like Durkheim creates, the sacred is divided into the pure and the impure, and both of those things are set aside from the everyday or the profane. So the way you know you have something sacred is it's set apart. That's what sacred means. It's set apart. Okay, so Agamben then works with that and uses that, and he says, okay, so this kind of makes some sense. The sacred is set apart. So in the next section on sacred life, so those who are in the category of Homo Sacred, again, they're unpunishable as well as being excluded from sacrifice. So they have this strange sort of double exception. So, so there's a double exclusion as defined on page 83, right? So, the topological structure drawn by this double exception is that of a double exclusion as well as a double capture. So you're both excluded from, you're excluded from religion and religious meaning, but at the same time, no one else is barred from killing you. So you're both excluded from the protections of everyday profane law. You're not protected, but you're also captured and defined by it because people are able to kill you. So you get this double determination, double exclusion. So it is life that cannot be sacrificed and yet may be killed. That's what sacred life is. Can't be sacrificed, but can be killed. So it's a kind of an odd definition here. So how did this come to be in existence? So he says, here it is. The sovereign sphere is the sphere in which it is permitted to kill without committing homicide and without celebrating a sacrifice. Sacred life, that is, life that may be killed but not sacrificed, is a life that has been captured in this sphere, right? So once you make the definition, anything that falls within that is there. Okay. So again, it's a structure that determines the content, not the other way around, right? Okay, page 84 is where he begins to talk about the sovereign who's making the decision, the exception, is also symmetrical and has the same structure as Homo Sacer. So both the sovereign and Homo Sacer are joined in the action of setting aside divine law and setting aside human law, so both the sacred and profane. And and that this becomes, he argues, the political base of the West, the region of politics. So it's a region between everyday sort of zoe, or everyday oikos, everyday economic action, and separate from religious action, that the space or the zone of the state of exception is the place of politics as such. Okay? All right. So then how does that happen? He begins to write about that. And that's what the next section is about. So he writes about the power of fathers to kill sons and to kill other family members. This was the position of the Nomos, of the person who was in control of a dominion, of a family. And then the father's power is the power of life and death over sons primarily. So you have domestic jurisdiction of the head of the family. The male citizen from birth defines becomes almost an archetype of the political power in general. You don't simply have natural life, but life that is exposed to death. Bare life or sacred life is originary political element. So a child growing up in a domain, the domos, the father, the patriarch, has the capacity to kill them. So the price to be part of the domain is to be subject to the annihilatory violence of the father, and that is also then the price to be paid for life in the imperium, in the political state, is that you are subjecting yourself to the capacity to be killed within it, right? All right. So there is no clearer way to say that the first foundation of political life is a life that may be killed, which is politicized to its very capacity to be killed. That's what allows you to be part of the polis and allows you to originally move into the realm of the political. Okay, so you actually take on the characteristics of Homo Sacer in order to be a subject of politics, to be in this political space. Okay, so politics is not quite mere religion, and it's not quite everyday rules of economics and so on, but it's falling in this intermediate space of exception. Okay, all right. So the state of exception and bare life are necessary then for politics, and making the distinction of who falls in and out, and then placing yourself within the immediate command of death and decision of death and of being excluded is part of being a subject of politics here. Okay, so this leads us into a consideration of the political theology, not of Carl Schmitt, but of Ernst Kantorowicz. His great book, The King's Two Bodies. So Agamben is basically arguing that kings are subjected, are themselves placed into this zone where they have this double determination. In Kantorowicz's work, he's writing about the physical body or the real imaginary body of the king, and distinguishing it from the sublime body, the majesty of the king. So there's the body of the king that rules, that's actually making decision, that's embodied, that has to go to sleep at night, that gets sick and dies. And then there's something else called the sublime body of the king that never dies. So when a king dies, Kantorowicz writes about this, right? In England at least, you recite the king is dead, and then immediately, long live the king. So even though the specific body of the specific king is gone and dead, the principle of kingship is going to carry on, and the successor immediately becomes the next sovereign, right? So the coronation is a kind of formal ritual of installation, but you're actually already mystically assuming the position that the kingship doesn't go away. Okay, so what Kantorowicz argues is that he believes that the king's two bodies isn't just and shouldn't be thought of in terms of the physical body and the sublime body, the body of the king that dies and the sublime concept of kingship that continues, but instead should be reconfigured as the sovereign and the sacred, right? So again, taking, you have a real imaginary sovereign who can die, and you have the sacred principle of the king that can't. And so to be in the capacity to make this sovereign distinction, to make the sovereign decision, the king is placed in a position where they are both sacred, consecrated even, but at the same time are outside of that order because their body is capable of dying. So he writes in here about all manner of funerals and funeral rites, kings that die with effigies, that the king will die and there's like an effigy installed instead, or where cases where sovereigns or subjects even will make something like a deal with the devil, where they will go into battle. They'll go through and consecrate themselves to the demons of the underworld or something, in exchange for winning a war. And then if they don't die in the war, they've already essentially sold their soul and or expended their sacred value. And so if they live past the soul, he says it's very embarrassing, right? So then you have to create, if you don't die, then they have to create an image or some kind of like a simulacrum of the person, and that gets buried or even burned instead. And then the person who's alive, whose sacredness has already died, their imaginary and real body still exists, but they're now in this never land, this zone where they can't be sacrificed again because that was already done. Their value is already used up. And so now they're outside of sacred protection and sacred society. So they're not natural life, but they are outside of the sacred order, and they're outside of the legal order as well. All right. So there's a lot of talk about that and about the way that So what he argues is that in the end, Homo Sacer and the sovereign are united in a paradigm that each has bare life that has been separated from its context, and that, so to speak, survives its death, right? The first death of the sacredness has already occurred, and that's incompatible with their human world, and then they become bare life after that, right? So Homo Sacer has been defined by the sovereign as outside, but the sovereign, him or herself, is outside as well. If they die, the sacred principle lives on or moves on from the body of the king. So back to Kantorowicz. So Kantorowicz's book spends the best chapter in the book is on Shakespeare's Richard II. And, there's the very famous deposition scene in Richard II where Richard has been defeated by Bolingbroke, his cousin, who becomes Henry IV. And so there's this moment when Henry IV is trying to get Richard to give up voluntarily his crown. And then once that happens, once that the king has lost the crown, what happens to the body of the king, right? So Henry IV can't have Richard II, the body, the person walking around out there, and so he winds up getting thrust in the tower and later executed and killed. So the body and image of the king. So for a while, Richard II becomes essentially Homo Sacer, the person who's living a kind of bare life. He was just sort of being fed and watered essentially in a cell. And he didn't have religious or political significance anymore. He was outside. He was still related to the political, related to Henry IV, and was being defined by Henry IV, but he lacked any significance. And so he was Homo Sacer. So to Agamben, Homo Sacer, the person who can't be sacrificed but can be killed without being tried, someone being tried for homicide, unites both the Homo Sacer and the sovereign, that they both have this, they've died one death, the sacred death, and now there's something that hasn't died yet, that there's something beyond, the bare life that still exists. Okay, so there it is. So the sovereign then has the capacity to constitute oneself and others as life that may be killed but not sacrificed. Okay, all right. So there's a symmetry between sovereignty and Homo Sacer. Okay, so page 101, we then go, I think that's it. Yeah, so page 101, that's the final definition then of sovereignty. Okay, you're self-defining. All right, we then go on to 104. One of my favorite chapters in the book is called The Ban and the Wolf. There's a shift from the Roman world essentially to the Germanic world, the Scandinavian world, where the concept of the outlaw, the banned, the banished, the outlaw becomes very clear, and we know that is essentially now what Agamben means by Homo Sacer, an outlaw. You're outside of the law. You're an outlander. Essentially, you're not part of the order, so you can't be defended or protected by the legal structure. It's said. So you've been banned. The concept of bandit, the word bandit, is linked to this. But now there's all these other terms that come in, these Germanic terms, right? Werewolf, the wolf man. Literally a werewolf, right? Comes from, so there's other concepts. The wolf's head, right? The outlaw, the person who has been condemned and banished. So whatever sacred value they would have had has already been expended in whatever kind of legal or political process that's defined them as outlaw. So they're already expent. They have no sacred value anymore, and so they can be killed without being homicidal, but their life no longer is sacrificial and can have meaning. So again, the ban is the central concept here. The werewolf, the outlaw, comes in. So the ban then falls somewhere in between natural life itself and the state, and it is in that position is where the state of exception is generated, and that's the place of sovereignty, the political space, and then the space of Homo Sacer. All right, so the originary political relation, then he argues, is marked by this zone of indistinction in which the life of the exile borders on the life of Homo Sacer, who may be killed but not sacrificed. This relation is more original than Schmittian opposition between friend and enemy. So that's Schmidt's big argument in the concept of the political. Schmidt argues that the political is brought into being by the definition of enemies. The friend-foe distinction is what generates the political. And Agamben is arguing that is less foundational than the distinction between Homo Sacer and the generation of the sovereign exception. So that, he argues, is the relation of exception that's more foundational and that generates the political. Okay, so that leads us here. If in modernity, so there it is. In the city, the banishment of sacred life is more internal than every interiority and more external than every extraneousness. In modern life, more and more clearly placed at this. Life is more and more, Zoe is more and more placed at the center of state politics. biopolitics in Foucault's sense. If our age, all citizens can be said in a specific and extremely real sense to appear virtually as Homo Sacer. This is possibly only because the relation of ban has constituted the essential structure of sovereign power from the beginning. So this is basically his argument, is that we move farther and farther along in modernity. The definition of the ban, of the exception, becomes ever more important, and ever, I guess, larger categories of people fall into that category, and then essentially all subjects of modern states constituted with this form of sovereignty take on ever larger, the coloring of Homo Sacer becomes more and more part of their subjectivity, right? So either we're expanding the category of Homo Sacer, or the flavoring or the qualities of Homo Sacer become generalized within the subjects, the populations under biopolitics. Okay, all right. I'm going to leave off the threshold here, except to say that he then writes that what confronts us today is a life that as such is exposed to a violence without precedent, precisely in the most profane and banal ways. Our age is the one in which a holiday weekend produces more victims on Europe's highways than a war campaign, but to speak of a sacredness of the highway railing is obviously an anti-phrastic definition. So he's arguing now, this is it, that the sacred, thinking in terms of the sacred, that the sacred is actually smaller. So he has a critique here of Georges Bataille, and says that the sacred is not like the dominant principle of life, but it's shrunk out or it's set aside by the sovereign, and that increasingly lives are gained and lost. Happiness is and flourishing is promoted or diminished, not in the name of sacredness, but in the name of Homo Sacer. So there's something here that isn't sacred. So like he said, so getting killed on the highway, well, that's just sort of like something that's happening, but it lacks the sacred dimension to it, in the sense that this is, like a tearing the fabric of society into collective trauma. So the wish to lend a sacrificial order to the extermination of Jews by means of the term Holocaust was, from this perspective, an irresponsible historiographic blindness. The Jew living under Nazism is the privileged negative referent of the new biopolitical sovereignty, and is as such a flagrant case of Homo Sacer, in the sense of a life that may be killed but not sacrificed. The killing constitutes neither capital punishment nor a sacrifice, but simply the actualization of a mere capacity to be killed, inherent to the Nazi definition of the Jew. So he doesn't want to cover this over with sacrificial veils. The Jews were exterminated not in a mad and giant Holocaust, but exactly as Hitler had announced, as bare life. So just taken out of the realm of the sacred, taking out of the realm of value, of placed in the realm of biopolitics and exterminated there. If you read Arendt, her argument that the absolute evil of the Holocaust wasn't merely, the destruction of life, but the elimination of, it was an erasure, total erasure that one had ever lived. So in the Nazi regime, those who died, their family wasn't allowed to mourn them. Records of them were removed. You couldn't speak their name, so it was an erasure, kind of a moral erasure. You had never lived. So you can't be reinstalled in even in mourning or in rituals. You're basically erased, and so this would fall into the category of biopolitics here. Again, I don't really like the argument, but there it is. Okay, so 119. So then he moves directly into Hannah Arendt's writings in Origins of Totalitarianism, her missing analysis of camps. She was going to do a thorough analysis of camps, didn't do it, and again she thought that there wasn't enough writing again about the concept of bare life or of biopolitics. All right, I'm going and in modern states, the right to life, to bare life, is a very problematic notion, as he writes about, page 122. Yeah, he makes a distinction here that I think is interesting. So one of my primary criticisms of Agamben is that he rarely references Marx, and even though it's just right there on the surface, the reference of capitalism being a structure that blows away sacredness and instead uses human beings as value, as simple energy sources for the production of commodities, capital, and money. And so people die into these things that aren't sacred, that their death, their production isn't sacred, but the things themselves take on this fetishized aura. So Agamben and Marx could come together very, very powerfully. It doesn't happen here. But he does say that, that the fundamental referent in parliamentary democracies becomes bare life, the care, the control, the use of bare life. This is what capitalism does. Takes them out of the realm of the sacred, and then deploys their bodies and their life energy in the production of commodities, value. And so bare life is what it's about. So biopolitics and capitalism go together in that sense. So the old distinctions of right and left, liberalism, totalitarianism, private and public, lose their clarity and intelligibility, enter that zone of indistinction because of the emergence of biopolitics, both in fascism and elsewhere. And then following, I just really like this, that the decision on life becomes a decision on death. So once the sovereign has the capacity to determine who's in or out, and once the state becomes focused upon biopolitics, the management and care of bare life of zoe, then the sovereign is not just determining biopolitics, who's fostered in life and thriving, but it turns into Thanos or Thanatopolitics, the politics of death. So death camps and euthanasia and warfare and making decisions about who dies and not, that this becomes part of sovereign activity. So the state then is entering an ever more intimate symbiosis, not just with legal experts, but also with doctors. Right now, this is clearly true, making decisions about who's going to get respirators or not. Scientists, how are we going to manage the pandemic? Experts of various kinds on epidemiology and so on. Religious experts, are we going to have people going to church or not? Are we going to have burials or not? Are we going to have to forestall funerals of our loved ones until after the pandemic's over? That the state is engaging with these different spheres, not just for promoting bio life, but thanato, death, right? And so that means that the camp is the pure, absolute, and impassable biopolitical space, and that it appears as the hidden paradigm in political space of modernity, whose metamorphosis disguises we'll have to learn to recognize. Okay, so he goes into a discussion of habeas corpus, sort of this basic right that your accusers have to be present, and you have to be present in a trial in order to be imprisoned. But it's about the body. He says it's not really about the soul of the person; it becomes all about the body. So he thinks that that's lending credence to these to biopolitics in the way that he means it. So the rights of man, again, so the idea that you have the right to happiness and so on are things that get defined in terms of biopolitics. And then in this section, what he's really writing about is refugees and the definition of who's going to be a citizen and not. So the refugee crisis of the last 5-6 years since this Syria, the Middle East, the incredible flows of populations across borders seeking political asylum, that this has generated the sovereign exception, and a lot of what sovereigns actions are doing then is deciding who's excluded from constitutional protection, right? So we don't have the universal right of man or the universal right of human beings. We don't have universal people. We have people who are defined as in or out, in a state of exception or not, depending upon certain categories. And what Agamben emphasizes that this is often based on birth, biological things, birthright, those kinds of things. The whole idea of heritage is about inheritance. Birth, you're born into a country, right? That blood and soil go together in some way. The nomos of the earth, for example, is that there's a long-standing and Schmittian writings about the Nomos of the earth, that the peasants who have died in a particular plot of space have a kind of correspondence with that place. You're native to it, right? And so this whole idea about the politics of nativity, the politics of being born, then sets up the politics of deciding the exception. Who's going to be outside? All right. So who's going to be preserved? Who's going to have political rights and so on? Who's going to be active citizens? This is from the French Constitution around the time of the Revolution. All inhabitants of a country must enjoy the rights of passive citizens. So you get rights, but not all are active citizens. Women, at least in the present state, children, foreigners, and all those who would not at all contribute to the political establishment are outside, right? So the sovereign has the capacity through the creation of the state of exception, not just to define that space, but then to define the sacred and political as well, right? Okay, so so who's on the inside and who's at the outside, the threshold, and so on. And then he writes about the new living dead, the person who now is in the Homo Sacer position. You're alive, but you can be killed. You have no value, no moral worth, are refugees. So he writes about refugees. And again, the link of nativity and nationality means that those who don't have access to the political because they weren't born in modern democracies, then fall into the category of bare life. They're people who are not men of rights or people of rights. They're refugees. So he writes about that as a category of Homo Sacer, and then denaturalized how as territories become more totalitarian and as the sovereign is using the state of exception as a mechanism to increase a power that you actually need denaturalization movements trying to take rights away from people. We've seen this right now in a way I haven't seen in my lifetime, that the payouts currently for the stimulus money in the wake of the pandemic, that the decision of who's getting the money or not is in some circumstances being determined by whether or not your spouse even is a migrant. And so only couples where both are citizens are getting bailout money, apparently, that the checks aren't going to those who have migrant spouses who aren't citizens. So again, I don't know all the detail about that, but if that's true, to the degree it's true, then again, the right of who's in and out is being determined by nativity. And we know that Trumpism, as such, that the contemporary configuration of the Republican Party that's associated with the Trump faction clearly has emphasized the real American, the heartland Americans, the people who are truly in. And with that birth nation link, right, is really important. Yeah, so the birth nation link, and that in order to become a citizen, there's going to have to be other processes that one goes through. The citizen was something of which one had to prove oneself worthy of, and which could therefore always be called into question. That weird film, Starship Troopers, the only way you can get citizenship was by either is essentially by going to war. So people went to war so they could become citizens. So it's that kind of thing, proving yourself in some way. Okay. There's a footnote on page 134 about sexuality. Just point to it about sexuality and Homo Sacer. So once you're in the category of the state of exception and you no longer are in a world of sacredness or moral ethics, you're in an era of bare life, then sexuality then is oriented towards bare life as well. So there's a discussion here of the Marquis de Sade's writings, of sadomasochism in general, and about the spread of sadomasochism. The sadomasochistic practices are essentially sexual practices, sexual techniques and technologies to bare life, rather than embracing a whole person, something along those lines. Again, I'm just following here what he's writing about. Okay, so now he's going to be moving into some really stark categories of people who have fallen into or been defined in the category of Homo Sacer, of bare life. life that doesn't have moral significance or moral worth. So for the first category, chapter 3 is the chapter about life that does not deserve to live. He cites really Nazi writers or German writers about unworthy people. So how horrible it is that there's often completely useless people that we're providing care, patience, and energy. We attempt, on the other hand, to keep in existence lives that are no longer worthy of being lived. Nature herself, often with cruel belatedness, takes away any possibility of the continuation. That there's some people who deserve to live, who have the right to live, who are worthy of life, and other people who aren't. So people who are dying don't get treated well. But then look at the institutes for the mentally impaired, the treatments they lavish on the patients. One cannot help being shaken by the sinister contrast between the sacrifice of the dearest human good on the one hand and the enormous care for existences that not only are devoid of value, but even outright to be valued, that ought to be valued negatively. So life devoid of value, people who are incurable idiots, who have progressive paralysis, right? People who have body defects and mental disorders, incurable, right? So you get a revival, frightening that these are people who are, I'm quoting the Nazi here, be it juridical, social, and religious, but they're nothing but the frightening reverse image of authentic humanity. So authorizing annihilation then, trying to the final decision to eliminate the unfit. So euthanizing these categories of people. People have a life devoid of value. So this is something the Nazis did. They euthanized people. So it wasn't just a sterilization program, that's in the next chapter here, but actually killing people. So there's a description here, that about 70 people a day came and were killed at a camp, basically. Young children, people who were as old as 93, ages 6 to 93, 70 a day. 60,000 people apparently were killed because they were defined as being incurably mentally ill by a couple of Nazi doctors. And then, so this is, again, thanato, or the politics of death, thanatopolitics. So biopolitics turns into thanatopolitics. So where you ever get the state of exception, you get bare life. Biopolitics, you're always also going to get death politics as well. The exercise of the sovereign power to decide on bare life in the horizon of the new biopolitical vocation of the National Socialist State. So he makes the argument that there was really no economic reason to kill these people. It was done primarily to demonstrate, or to exercise, or to demonstrate the power of the exception and the strength of the sovereign for the capacity to do it. So the sovereign who, insofar as he decides on the state of exception, has the power to decide which life would be killed without the commission of homicide. In the age of biopolitics, this power becomes emancipated from the state of exception and transferred to the power to decide the point at which life ceases to be politically relevant. So again, it becomes generalized. So this is like in Foucault, where the mad inside help define the civilized outside. The exception winds up spreading outside. So these categories have a kind of contagion about them. So the eugenics movement as such is the subject of chapter 4, a discussion of in other words, this is sort of about, again, a great opportunity here missed to reference Marx. So Germany began paying attention to living wealth. So they were doing a kind of an accounting of the wealth of the German people. And some of it was, in fact, the bulk of it was the living wealth, not the wealth in material sense, but the living wealth of the human population was calculated as 1,061 million marks at the time. And so that once you begin paying attention to living wealth and valuing labor as such, value because you're going to extract value, life from these people, then taking care of those people, being concerned with the biological body of the nation, making sure that these are good workers, getting rid of or limiting those who aren't going to be good workers, who we can't get much value out of, in the Marxist sense that this becomes part of biopolitics. So there was an obvious opportunity on page 145 to really connect to Marx. But there's descriptions here of the eugenics movement, then the totalitarianization of our century. has its ground in this dynamic identity of life and politics without which it remains incomprehensible. So actually, again, why is the state getting involved in deciding who is a fit person to reproduce? Who is a fit person to have children? Why is it getting involved in this? Well, it's biopolitics. So Nazism did it. The totalitarian phenomena in its entirety should be situated within the realm of biopolitics. When life and politics, originally divided, are linked together by means of the no man's land of the state of exception that is inhabited by bare life, you begin to become one. All life becomes sacred, and all politics becomes the exception. So if we go back to that image on page 28, right, wasn't it 28, 26? Is it 38? I'm sorry, I can't find my own picture here. There it is, on page 38. So this is traditional life where biology, or, the bare life of human beings, reproduction, and so on, political life, politics are separate. The state of exception brings it inside, and then as we're moving into this normalization of the state of exception, they begin to totally coincide. So biopolitics is here. The state of exception is here. The state of exception is where biological life is incorporated within politics in the state of exception, but as the state of exception becomes normalized in biopolitics, you're here. The political takes over the management of biological functions, including reproduction, who dies, when you die, do you have the right to suicide, do you have the right to assisted suicide, do you have a right to reproductive technology, reproductive information, birth control, abortion, and so on? Do you have access to these things that allow the individual to manage their own reproduction? Well, this becomes part of the state enterprise here. So life and politics originally divided, linked together by the means of the no man's land of the state of exception, and then it spreads so that it becomes one. All life becomes sacred, and all politics becomes the exception. Okay? So the Nazis then determined another number of people, page 149, who fell into this category. So if one of the betrothed suffers from a contagious disease that might seriously threaten the spouse or descendants, one of the betrothed is debarred to temporarily award. One of the betrothed, while not award, suffers from a mental illness that might make the marriage seem undesirable. One of the betrothed suffers from one of the hereditary diseases provided for by the law that this bars reproduction. Sterilization took place on a number of categories. Again, the thanatopolitics, actually killing people, it was here as well. So the Führer got a list of 6 persons and then making decisions about who's going to live or die. Thanatopolitics, death politics. Okay, so again, the Nazi tendencies, Nazism wasn't an aberration to Agamben. It was demonstrating the normalization of biopolitics and needed to be under that realm. Chapter 5 is this horrific chapter dealing with human experiments on people who were taken from the camps. Description of a young 37-year-old Jewish woman, good health, was depressurized during experiments of depressurization. Brutal description of what happens to her as she's killed, and then the dissection that took place afterwards. Nazis did things where they were trying to find out how long it would take someone to die of hypothermia in cold water. They'd bring them back out of the cold water, try to revive them, and so on. Make people drink salt water to see how long they would take to kill them. Give them diseases and see how long that would take. So all of that human subjects stuff that we now make certain that we try to control, was here. So these so the main point, Agamben argues that these aren't acts of sadomasochism, they're acts of biopolitics, that there are categories of people who are outside of the protections of the law, have no civil rights, and are therefore capable of being treated as subject of experimentation. And then he says, in many ways, again, as we're moving into this new world of the normalization of biopolitics, that all of us are capable to be treated in this way. All right. And then chapter 6 deals with being brain dead, the definition of being brain dead, and so on. Vegetative state. He's talking about politics about that and decision making about that. How this becomes part of biopolitics, about what happens to people at the very end of life who wind up in homes or kept alive merely technologically. Yeah, the idea, kind of this horrible idea, the specter of bodies, of neomorts, which have the legal status as corpses but would maintain some of the characters of life for the sake of possible future transplants. They would be warm, pulsating, and urinating. This horrible description here of sort of dark futures where the bare life of the body can be kept alive long after a moral life could be led. All right, so bare life then is something that's being managed there. The last chapter we're going to talk about is chapter 7 on the camp is the Nomos, the ordering principle of the modern. And again, this is that really, really painful chapter about all of the connections that were made, the state of emergency, the state of exception, the sovereign decision, the sovereign exception that's made, the state of siege that was used, the legal foundation that allowed for the president of the Reich to generate the state of exception that allowed for the generation of the camps. The state of exception that ceased to be referred to as an external provisional state of factual danger comes to be confused with juridical rule itself, so it takes over everything. And this is it. So he's arguing that the camp is the space that is opened up when the state of exception begins to become the rule. Okay? So whenever this happens, whenever biopolitics generalizes, you wind up with a state of exception. All right. And then the camps had no rule of law, and everything was up to the camp directors. Again, so you're outside of the moral order. Camp normalizes the state of exception. The camp is a hybrid of law and fact in which the two terms become indistinguishable. Within the camp, everything is possible. Hannah Arendt is referenced there. And again, we use camps. We use them. It would be more honest and above all more useful to investigate carefully juridical procedures and deployments of power by which human beings are so completely deprived of their rights and prerogatives that no act committed against them could appear any longer as a crime. So Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, and then the ICE camps that we've created, again in Texas, Florida, that are holding people right now who are, seeking asylum, refugees. Okay, so let's see if I've got most of what I want. Yeah. So again, during, the camp demonstrates that law can be set aside and that the Führer then becomes the living law, a kind of speaking totem for the society. So politics as such, democratic politics as such, goes away because during the emergency, during the state of exception, the sovereign becomes the unitary sovereign, decisionism, right? So, a living law, right? The separation of powers that characterizes the liberal democratic state loses its meaning, even if it remains formally in effect. The difficulty of judging according to normal juridical criteria when judging those officials who did nothing other than execute the word of the Führer becomes difficult. So, people, again, you really suspend rights, civil rights, and law oversight, all of those kinds of things. So then these apparently innocuous spaces. So here's the argument that's being made, that the essence of the camp consists in the materialization of the state of exception and the subsequent creation of a space in which bare life and the juridical rule enter into a threshold of indistinction. Bare life and law override each other. So just like in those monasteries, which I mentioned in the last video, in which the rule of the monastery becomes something that's almost liturgical, the life itself is a form of life that's structured completely by this, even though it's outside of actual law. This is what happens in the camps in a negative, very, very negative way. So apparently innocuous spaces delimit a space in which the normal order is suspended, atrocities are committed, civility goes away. So the birth of the camp in our time appears an event that decisively signals the political space of modernity itself. Biopolitics is now normalized, right? So we're no longer in a world structured by land, order, and birth, but now we're structured instead by the camp, by the definition of the state of exception, the sovereign exception, the sovereign who grabs power and expands power by essentially suspending law, and then using that emergency power to define some people as outside of the law, outside of civil rights, placing those people in camps, and then using that not just to control that category person, but to spread those powers outside. Like Foucault writes about in Madison Civilization, it wasn't just the mad in the asylum that were contained and controlled, but you actually wound up structuring what it meant to be civilized and reasonable outside by what went on in the camp. So the relation of exception is being normalized here, and that then becomes essentially, he writes about Yugoslavia, the Balkan, wars, what happened there, rape camps that emerged, these new forms that went on. So again, this biological nomos of the planet isn't located in the city or the shopping mall. You know that the way that the world is being structured is through the creation of camps in which people who have been defined as lacking rights, lacking civil rights, aren't real citizens. That's where they're placed. They're treated in a way that's different, and that becomes the space, right, that then makes everyone the subject of biopolitics. So the more that the sovereign has the capacity to decide who's in and out, we're all subject to the sovereign's decision. So democratic politics as such vanishes. The sovereign takes on as much power, more power even, than something like a king would have had in Kantorowicz's work, right? So here it is. So, the disinherited, I'm trying to see where this is at. I'm missing this here. Yeah. So the wretched, the oppressed, the defeated get excluded. That we're multiplying the categories of people that don't get included in. Class conflict could have been included in here. So essentially, let's just end it then on page 181. So here's his basic argument. The original political relation is to ban. The state of exception is the zone of indistinction between outside and inside of politics, exclusion and inclusion, right? And that is what constitutes the political order. It isn't an agreement. It's not a kind of a state of cooperation. It isn't a social contract. It's a ban by a sovereign who subsumes all power by creating the capacity to bind people in and out, and outside the law, inside the law, define the state of exception. That fundamental activity of sovereign power then is this: the production of bare life by defining the boundary, the barrier between bare life and politically valuable life, who has rights, who doesn't, who's part of the polity, who isn't. And it isn't the city, but it's the camp, the concentration camp, the containment camp, the ice camp, that is the fundamental biopolitical paradigm of the West. So very, very dark arguments there, uniting, again, a lot of the best of late 20th century social theory, and it's been a very influential text for defining 21st century critical social theory as well. I hope this was useful. I know we covered a lot.